we do want to post it on our website. So again, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all. The League welcomes you to the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act Town Hall with our guest, Congressman George Latimer of the 16th Congressional District here in Westchester County. Before we get started, let's review just a few housekeeping items. As we have many attending the town hall this evening, please keep your audio on mute. While the congressman is speaking, please post your questions in the chat room, and we will get to as many of them as we can, provided we close by 7 p.m., right after the congressman's presentation. So it will be important with so many people to keep their audio muted and post your questions in the chat room. And then finally, I want to remind you all that the event is being recorded and it will be posted on the LWVW.org website post the event. And we will send out a reminder email once it is uploaded, probably by tomorrow. Also want to share with you, the League of Women Voters empowers voters and defends democracy through advocacy, education, and litigation at the local, county, state, and national levels. The League is fully committed to ensure compliance, both in principle and in practice, with the national organization's policy. Membership is open to everyone 16 years of age or older. As a nonpartisan political organization, the League of Women Voters of Westchester does not support or oppose candidates or political parties. However, we do advocate for issues that affect voter rights, and the SAVE Act is one of those issues. The League of Women Voters from the national level to the local level opposes the SAVE Act as it is an act of voter suppression. So as the congressman will inform us this evening, the SAVE Act would undermine election integrity based on misinformation about who is voting. The bill will make it significantly harder, if not outright impossible, for millions of eligible voters to register or re-register to vote and have their voices heard. So now let's turn tonight's town hall over to Congressman George Latimer to explain what the SAVE Act is, why it's being proposed, and why it is not fair to all American citizens. And as a reminder, enter your questions into the chat and they will be addressed after the presentation. So Congressman Latimer, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Kathy, thank you very much. And I appreciate you and the League of Women Voters of Westchester County for having this forum. Give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about this particular bill because of its proximity to being placed on the floor of the House. Earlier today, we had a press conference in the rather cold environment out in front of the county courthouse, the Martin Luther King statue. And Kathy was there on behalf of the League and spoke on behalf of the League and your position on this bill since you've researched it and addressed it. And I saw friends of mine like Louise Perez and Beth Radow and others who were there present as well. And we had a wide range of individuals from other organizations. It's important to note that the League is joined by the AFL-CIO and the NAACP as significant national organizations that have opposed this bill. So this is not just, the usual type of, back and forth ping pong between the parties. And I do recognize we're in a nonpartisan setting. I don't intend to speak in a partisan fashion, but where there are certain facts, I'll reference those facts and they may draw conclusions out of partisan. I'm in Congress now for a little over 6 weeks, so I am hardly an expert down in Washington. My experience in other levels of government, you're all familiar with my time as county executive, the state legislature, and the county legislature, et cetera. This is something different and something new. Walking in the door 6.5 weeks ago, absent the first 2 weeks, which were the last 2 weeks of the Biden administration, you're starting to learn a new system. And now for the last 4 weeks under President Trump, a completely different set of priorities thrown at us at 100 miles an hour. And while we're having a Zoom on HR 22, we could probably have a nightly Zoom about one issue or another that's on the table. In the last few weeks, we were discussing a potential pause in funding that had already been approved by the federal government. And while we were discussing that and coming to some grips with it, Elon Musk and his Doge group started to cut major parts of the county government. While we started discussing the DOGE issue, now Ukraine is on the table. So we've had a very difficult time in public policy when so many different major things are being thrown at us, and an issue like HR 22 can be lost in the sauce. One of the things that concerns me, I'm not surprised by it, but the majority side of the aisle, which was the majority in the prior session of the House, the 118th Congress, before I served there, had a number of different pieces of legislation. The SAVE Act was one of them, and many of them have appeared in the early weeks of the 119th Congress. The Lake and Riley bill, which has an immigration element to it, the Fix Our Forest bill, which has an environmental element to it, the Girls in Sports bill, which is basically an anti-transgendered bill. All of these bills have been voted on in the prior House by the majority as it existed and were brought back before the Congress in the last few weeks and voted on with solid support of the majority. And those of us in the minority voting in the main in opposition. Some bills had some Democratic support, but the bulk of them had unanimous support of the majority Republican side of the aisle. So when we understood that HR 22 was coming up, we were told a couple of weeks ago it would be on the ballot for next week. We believe that's going to be true. That is when, the alarm bells go off and we have a dialogue so that people understand what's at stake. The bill itself is presented in its language as a way to stop any voter fraud that may exist by people who are not entitled to vote because they are not American citizens. Their acronym SAVE, I think, is a misnomer. The acronym that I think matters most, and I said it earlier today, is Stop All Voter Engagement. Because what we're doing here is stopping the engagement that has been created by having mail ballot and mail registration that makes it easier for people to vote and opens the door for people who are busy, who have to go to work every day. They may go to a different location, different city, who have other pressures of life, and they can't always engage in person to do certain types of things. And the voting system as it had existed in New York before required those things, and the New York State Legislature has changed voting laws to make it more open and more easier for people to vote. And now the SAVE Act would do the exact opposite. It would impose upon New York State, which is where we all live, and other such states, Massachusetts, California, Illinois, the same type of principles that have been imposed in Texas and Georgia and a number of other states, for which voter suppression has been more of a way of life. The southern states had poll taxes. The southern states had literacy tests for many, many years. Those were wiped out by a Supreme Court. But now the SAVE Act represents a different type of thing. The basic premise of the SAVE Act is that in stopping individuals who are not eligible to vote, it requires in-person appearance before for all purposes, County Board of Elections to show proof that you are an American citizen. And when you present that that's what the bill does, it certainly sounds plausible. A person should be able to prove that they're an American citizen to avoid a certain abuse. On the other hand, this bill does not apply in a narrow scope. It applies in a broad-based scope. Any change you make to your voter registration requires an in-person appearance. And if, to answer the question Louise has just put in the box, if this law goes into pass, it will change New York State law and practice. So we will not be able to use a mail application to change our name, change our address, change our party registration, or any of those simple things that go into your voting information. I live at a particular address in Rye. If I were to move across town in Rye, I would have to, under this law, go to the County Board of Elections in person, bring my wife with me, and we would have to in person prove that we were American citizens. Doesn't matter, I've been voting since 1972. I would have to have a birth certificate and or passport to prove that I was an American citizen, and my wife would have to do the same because we were moving across town. I hope the day never comes where my wife has to change her name. She did it once when we got married in 1982. If she changed her name for any reason, she would have to go to the County Board of Elections in White Plains and show proof that she's an American citizen, even though she's been voting since 1972, to justify the change of her name. if I were a college student, and would be an accurate story. I didn't go away to school, but when I move back to my parents' house after being in college for 4 years, and I get a job in Manhattan, which is what happened in my life, and I'm leaving my college environment where I voted, and I have to now re-register at my parents' house where I once registered when I was in high school, I would have to go to the County Board of Elections to change my registration and to prove that I was an American citizen. Now, a college student may have a passport that he may or may not have. A poor person may or may not have a passport. So if you don't have a passport, your driver's license is not sufficient. Almost every time I'm asked when I travel on an airplane for identification, I hand my New York driver's license. They look at it. They see that it looks like me, not a particularly good picture, but it looks like me. And that verifies my presence. If anybody were ever to challenge me when I sign a credit card check, they'd ask to see a form of identification. I'd show them my New York State driver's license. That is not sufficient under the SAVE Act for identification. You have to show a birth certificate. Now, a birth certificate for me is not something I carry on me every day. And I would have to remember to find my birth certificate in a filing cabinet in my attic so that I would make the trip to White Plains and make it once, not go, show them my driver's license that I'm George Latimer. That's insufficient. Go back home and come back another day to prove that you are George Latimer. And it's worse for my wife because my wife's birth certificate has a different last name on it, her birth name, not her married name. And not only do you change your name when you get married, but many times you change your name when you get divorced. And with all of the other things that happen during a divorce, you would have to go to the County Board of Elections in person to prove that going back to your birth name or some other name made sure that you're a United States citizen. The fact that you change your registration, there are people who are independent and they decide to enroll in a major party, or they decide to change their party enrollment to independent or any other variant along the way. There was a lot of that happened in the last couple of election cycles. You could not do that by mail. You would have to go in person to the County Board of Elections to do that. Now, County Board of Elections, fine organization. It operates Monday to Friday, roughly 9 to 5. If you have a roughly 9 to 5 job, you're taking time off from your work to do these things. And if you can do it in one shot, good for you. But you're losing time at your work. If you work in Manhattan or you work in some other location, not anywhere near White Plains, I've had the good fortune to work in White Plains, so it's not much of a problem. But if you don't work in White Plains, that causes a problem for you. And then how easy is it for you to get your birth certificate? I live in Rye. I happen to have been born in Mount Vernon. Bit of a schlep to go down to Mount Vernon, go to the city clerk's office and get a copy of my birth certificate. But what if I was born where I had previously lived in Pennsylvania? I'd have to go in person to Pennsylvania to the town that I would have been born in, or perhaps North Carolina, or perhaps Georgia, perhaps rural North Carolina or Georgia, if that's where I was from. This is what the SAVE Act requires. Then in terms of the information that you have to provide, if you have the accurate documentation, keep in mind those documentations don't prove where you live. That your address is not necessarily on those documents. So there's a second set of information. And if you miss anywhere along the line, you have to come back, wait, do it again, get to the Board of Elections. There's usually a line for attention. Different people are there for different reasons. What the SAVE Act is doing is creating barriers that you have to leap over, that you should not have to worry about. And the purpose behind it is not to make sure that a person who is not an American citizen is voting. The purpose is to make it harder for you to vote and maybe discourage you from voting. Maybe you show up at the voting polls and you haven't gone through this process and you're questioned when you come to sign in with the voting book. The law itself says, and I encourage you to read the law. Don't take my word for it. The league has a copy of it. I'm sure they're happy to send you an email that you can read the language yourself. The law in it has sanctions for Board of Elections personnel if they don't enforce the law. And the sanctions include up to prison time. What does that mean? It means if you work for the Board of Elections and you don't challenge somebody, you might be liable for criminal prosecution. So therefore, it's more likely you're going to challenge people and you're going to challenge more people. And a person comes to the voting desk and you get challenged, And that person is intense about challenging you because they're on the hook to try to verify whether you've had accurate or not. Now, if all of these steps were necessary because we were stamping out a problem, you might say, well, I guess, we're swamped with illegal voting and we have to do something about it. We have to safeguard America's voting. We have had in Westchester County, we're all from Westchester County. We've had in Westchester County 3 migrant asylum seeker placements that just closed up about a month or two ago. But for the better part of 2 years, they were located in Ardsley, in White Plains, and in Yonkers. And we had at one point up to about 500 people, men, women, and children. How many adults? A little bit less than 500. Maybe it's roughly 350 to 400 adults. Not once did we get a report that any of those individuals who were here seeking asylum made an effort to vote in any election. Now, you might say an individual might do this in some locations. Certainly, there are individual incidences that happen anytime. But if you were looking for a mass effort, you would look to see if someone wanted to get all of the migrants in Ardsley to come out and vote in an election, or all of the migrants that were sitting in White Plains or Yonkers to come out and vote in an election. It did not happen. Didn't happen. And when you multiply that out by so many of the places in the states that will be affected by this, there's been no study, no report that's been issued that says, my friends, we have a crisis in the number of people that are voting that we think are illegal. This tracks back to the 2020 election, when claims were made that the 2020 election was decided on a fraudulent basis. Now, the argument was the presidential race was on a fraudulent basis. Nobody challenged the fact that the House of Representatives or the Senate were done on a fraudulent basis. Those were fine. But the presidential race was on a fraudulent basis. And one of the accusations that was made, it was taken to a variety of different courts in a variety of different states, is that there were illegal residents who were voting in this election. No proof made. But out of the desire to argue that there is a crisis and it requires legislation, the legislation goes far beyond what the perceived crisis would be. So there was no discernible crisis. And then the law that was written broadly enough to include college students, people who move, women who go through any natural change in their names, people who just want to change their registration in any fashion. So I assert that the proper name for this bill is the Stop All Voters Engagement Act. Let me summarize and close and then open it up to any questions that you have. If there are flaws in the bill, and the sponsors of the bill determine that they've heard these arguments and they take the bill back to do some work on it, and they're willing to meet with some of the minority party to negotiate out those things, then that would be a positive sign of a mature legislative process where someone says, hey, I want to do something, but I realize there may be problems in the bill as I presented it. Let's work it over and let's refine it. And let's do things that would eliminate some of these things. There's no such desire to do that. This is a desire to pass this bill because they have the votes to do it in the House. In the Senate, this bill could well be filibustered, assuming that the majority of the Senate does not eliminate the filibuster to benefit the fact that they have a majority, but not a supermajority that can break a filibuster. And then this vote passes. But if this vote passes and it's signed into law by President Trump, it will change our lives. If you live in Somers and you decide to move to Heritage Hills from a private house in Somers, you better prepare to find documents that you may not have at fingertip, and then pick a date to drive down to the county office, the county board of elections, and change your registration and go through the whole rigmarole and hope that you can do it in one shot. And if you don't do it and you show up at election day at the polls, you may be denied voting under this act. That's what HR 22 means.
Okay, George, thank you very much. We have a number of questions in the chat room, so I'm just going to open up the chat so I can read through some of these for you. And I'll also let you know who actually posted it. So we'll go by the names. I think you addressed Louise Perez's question about the SAVE Act affecting our registration. So I will move on. We've got Harvey Brownstein. And Harvey is asking, does this bill require 60% of the Senate's approval, or are we talking about a simple majority?
Well, in the Senate, and keep in mind, I'm learning the House rules right now in my seventh week. I wouldn't purport to know all of the Senate rules, but my understanding of the Senate is that the Senate requires a simple majority to pass this unless there's a filibuster. And a filibuster, which exists in the Senate, does not exist in the House. There's a number of senators talk this bill and talk this bill through and delay or deny a vote. The vote for cloture to stop a filibuster takes 60 votes. So the general math is that if you have a bill that has 60 votes, a filibuster is unnecessary because you can have a vote of cloture and bring it to a vote. If this falls along partisan lines, I hope it doesn't, but if it falls along partisan lines, the majority side does not have sufficient votes to stop the filibuster. So in theory, the bill could be killed by a filibuster. Now, the majority side, if the House passes this bill, let's say in the next week, the bill comes up. There are 219 Republicans, 215 Democrats. If it falls into the pattern of all Republicans do this and all Democrats do this, then the bill will pass. It will go to the Senate, and then at that point in time, the Senate might determine that they want to negotiate, and that negotiation would get some Senate votes necessary for cloture. And then in which case you might see a negotiating change. But right now, and this answers, I think, one of the other questions about negotiations, the majority does not see a reason to negotiate because I believe they've head counted and they have enough majority side votes to pass the bill regardless. Us raising this issue, the league's position, the AFL-CIO's position, us raising the issues to make people know this is not a passage in the night. This is not something that doesn't affect me because, I'm not an immigrant, or it doesn't affect me because I don't work for USAID. This affects every single one of us as a voter, potentially in terms of this. So yes, the Senate, in theory, could filibuster to death, but I can't be sure what the Senate will do. And a lot of it depends on how it handles in the House.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Linda Ray. And Linda says, well, it's a comment. Basically, this act is preventing people with disabilities from making these registration changes.
That would be correct, and I know Linda very well, and Christina, and anybody who is disabled in whatever level of disability it is, going to do something in person is infinitely more difficult than doing it by mail. If it's something that can be done by mail, and certainly there are some things that you'd have to argue can be done in person, but we have a system of registration changes which you can easily do by mail, and when you sign it. That's your signature. Your signature is verifiable based on what already is on file. When I sign a check, I don't have to prove it's George Latimer. My signature on the check looks like the other signatures, and the check is accepted by the bank. So in this case, a mail change of registration is not acceptable, and Linda would have to, get in a car and go from Lewisboro down to White Plains on a business day and maneuver given all of those difficulties. And it's an unnecessary situation and it becomes a disincentive. Linda's pretty motivated, but somebody else in the same situation might say, oh, this is too much work. This is going to put me out. I've got to get somebody to drive me. How am I going to handle and that's what I think the purpose of the bill is to get people who are in situations like Linda's to say, no, I give up. It's not that important to me.
Okay. Our next question is from JR. Do you need just a passport or do you need something else to go along with it?
Well, since this bill hasn't gone into effect yet, I'm not sure how they will administer it. They say in the bill that a birth certificate or a passport would be sufficient. Now, when you apply for a passport, I have a passport. When you apply for a passport, you go through certain documents that prove that you are a U.S. citizen. So by dint of holding a valid passport, you're fine. It takes a while to get a passport. So if you don't have one, my wife doesn't have one, to apply for a passport is going to be problematic. We happen to have enhanced driver's licenses, so the most likely foreign country that we would go into would be Canada. And we can get into Canada on our New York State enhanced driver's license. But if we want to go overseas, she'd have to get a passport. It's a long drawn out process. If you can produce your birth certificate, you can do that. But as I said, in the case of my wife, she has no passport and her birth certificate has her birth name on it. And so she would have to go through some hoops to try to prove that she is in fact Robin Latimer, not Robin Phelps, and is a U.S. citizen. So the passport requirement is, I think, an alternative. If I have to go back and look at the bill, I think it's listed as one of the things that would be acceptable. I see Sandra Seligson is looking at the bill. Seligson is looking at the bill. Sandra, if you read the actual language, by all means, share it with us. But my understanding, it is one of the things that are offered, but there are not many things that are offered. They don't accept a military ID. They don't accept a driver's license. Those are the common things that you would use. And, again, getting the birth certificate is not a simple process if you don't already have one available.
Okay. JR posted another question too, talking about the real ID, driver's license. Apparently that's not sufficient. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure because I'm not sure exactly what the parameters of the real ID are versus the enhanced driver's license. What I do know, though, is if you happen to have an advanced driver's license and it's acceptable, fine. But if you don't already have the advanced driver's license, you would have to apply for that. And that isn't a 5-minute process. I happen to have an enhanced driver's license. I'm not sure if it's the same as real ID. I think real ID is what gets you on an airplane or something like that. I'm not sure. But the bottom line is that you would now have to sit there and say, okay, I may have to change information on my voter registration, and I would need to get additional information done before I can do that in order to have sufficient identification. All of this is not necessary. My signature, your signature. I know Harvey Braunstein. We have breakfast. Harvey Braunstein is enough. I know Luis Perez. Luis Perez's signature is enough. That should be enough unless you have a reason to suspect it. The signatures don't match up, or there's something else about the application that causes you to say there might be an issue here. Let us do a spot check on this particular individual. And this applies if you voted for 25 or 30 years under the current system. You'd still have to prove your identity the 31st year if you had to change your registration in some fashion.
Okay. Our next question is from Terry Toll. And Terry is asking, what committees in the House and Senate can we voice our opposition to this disgusting SAVE Act?
Well, Terry, this has gone past the committees now, so it's going to go to the floor of the House. It's been reported. Again, I'm a little light on this, but whatever the rules process that the Speaker controls, they're reporting it to the floor. So at this stage of the game, the contact is to members of the House. And what I have to tell you is that looking at the past time this came up to a vote, there are members of the House that are not there, that were there previously, but many of the members of the majority are still there, and those majority members are the ones that would have to be influenced to vote no. If we had 3 votes change, if we had 3 Republicans that would say, well, I'm sorry, let me take it back. It passed with 5 Democrats, but it had all of the Republicans. So that combination together means there's a gap of a certain number of votes. That's higher than the minimum. If the 5 Democrats reconsidered and decided that they would oppose the bill, and a couple of Republicans would oppose it, that would be enough to stop it. Most likely, if those individuals expressed opposition, they'd express it to their leadership, and the bill would get pulled rather than voted down. That's generally what happens, and I've seen that in both houses of the state legislature. When there's insufficient support, you pull the bill, and then you determine if you're going to amend the bill, or you're just going to let it sit there for a while because the principles of it aren't sufficient. But what I would say, if the real question is, who do I contact to express my opinion, then I would say, since we're New Yorkers, the Republican members of the New York House delegation that voted for this bill the last time, that is a discernible number of people. Perhaps the league has a list of who voted for it the last time, and the league can share that with your members who voted for it, who voted against it, perfectly objective. And then you determine that you wanted to reach out to those individuals, fine. Now, they may not care if you don't live in the district. Some of you do, some of you don't. Live in my district. And if you're in Westchester and you don't live in my district, then you live in the other district, which has a Republican rep. But I would argue that if you have family, you want to write to someone, that would be where you'd have to press the buttons. The reality is, and I think you've seen this already, and I may cross the line, Kathy, mute me if you have to, but we've seen a very consistent majority voting in its entirety. And we've seen that on these other bills that I've talked about, the Lake and Riley bill, some of you may know what that is, and some of these other bills. There is a political climate created by Donald Trump's popularity in his party, and created by Elon Musk and his unique, unprecedented role as the wealthiest man in the world by the president's side. And he controls one of the biggest social media platforms that exists. So there's tremendous influence on individual members of Congress to sort of honor what the president and co-president Musk want. And that's what you're fighting when you're trying to lobby my colleagues across the aisle who previously voted for it.
Thank you, George, and you were not out of line. That's fine.
I'm trying. I am trying hard.
I know you are. I know you're trying very hard. Thank you. Wilma Mann has a question. Aren't any Republicans in Congress, most specifically Mike Lawler, worried that this bill would disenfranchise their voters too?
I can't speak to the motivation. It's hard for me not to see something that's happening within your party that you object to. Let me personalize it and take it into a different area as an analogy. I thought Joe Biden was a good president, but I thought he did a poor job at the border. And as the county executive of Westchester County dealing with the asylum seekers, I called out the Biden administration for not establishing a immigration court in the White Plains U.S. District Courthouse. And I indicated I thought that was a necessary thing in order for us to handle the migrant situation. They didn't do it. I objected to it, but I certainly was not afraid to tell the president of my own party I thought he was wrong. I felt the same way about the Afghanistan pullout, but I didn't comment as a county executive because we're not involved in foreign policy. And then right at the very end of the presidency, I was critical that we did not get the information I wanted to see out of the White House on these mystery drones that were flying overhead, that none of us knew what they were. The county didn't know, the state didn't know, it was the federal government that needed to know. So when I thought that people in my party in positions of authority, whom I respect, and I understand how powerful they are, um, uh, when I thought that they were not doing something of a certain level, I didn't have a problem uh, being critical and not necessarily nasty critical, but I'm not watching that on the other side of the aisle at the moment. What I'm watching is sort of a lockstep. And so to the extent that someone makes an assessment, yes, my voters are upset, but I'm more worried about being out of step with the leaders of my party because they have certain sanctions. And the sanctions may be to run a primary against me or to put money into some opponent. But it's hard for me to know what they're thinking. I think there's a lot of people who vote for this who believe in this. They just believe that we should have a more rigid standard of the way we vote. And if you can't come in person and you can't prove you're an American, you should be able to prove it anytime I ask you. And this is the way we make America great again. This is some people just think that. But for some, maybe there's some who are, sleeping with a pea under their mattress and they realize that this is not a good thing and maybe not even a popular thing, but they're going to vote for it because they have political reasons to vote for it.
Okay, thank you. Claudia Mausner has a question. How about Republicans giving funding to double the size of all Board of Election offices? This is really an unfunded mandate, which Republicans typically oppose.
That is a very good point, which I failed to mention in my general comments. This bill, if it goes into effect, will require New York State and Westchester County to spend a significant amount more money on their election process, Board of Elections process. They'll need more personnel at the Board of Elections to handle all of these people coming in at the front desk. You're not going to be able to manage it with the staff you have now. And there is no funding in this bill, nor any guaranteed funding, particularly at a time where you're cutting funding. I was just on a Zoom before this where we're starting to project what we may see in a budget bill, and it's cuts to Medicaid, it's cuts to essential services. They're certainly not going to argue that we're going to cut Medicaid and at the same time give more money to our elections officials. So I think if your attitude is to decrease voting and access to voting, and you don't have enough staff, why, that helps you solve your problem as well. People come in, they see a 37-person line, and they go, "Forget this. I'm out of here. I'm not doing this." And I think that satisfies the mission of suppressing votes. So I don't think they have a commitment to add the staff necessary. And certainly, if we did have to add, this I can comment on as a county executive, when you get a mandate like this, you have to rearrange priorities. If we make the decision we don't want to raise taxes, And certainly, we don't want to raise taxes to satisfy a mandate that we don't even like. We're stuck. And at some point in time, not only do you have to live under the onerous provisions, but you may have to pay more taxes to live under these onerous provisions.
Thank you, George. Now, you know as well as I, the League of Women Voters, especially here in Westchester, is really focusing on youth engagement. And you know we've been out in the high schools and college campuses, et cetera. So the next question ties into this from Judy Gorenstein, and she's asking, what would high school students need to register to vote?
Well, because these things are in person, and I have to read the bill carefully, I'm not sure that they necessarily allow remote registration in the way we have it today. I mean, I'd probably have to get an interpretation of it from reading the language. The League of Women Voters is great about this. You have a table you set up at a high school, you set up in front of a grocery store, and you invite people to fill out an application, mail application, which you put in, which registers you to vote. I presume under the provisions of this law, you can't do that because if you're registering to vote for the first time, you're going to need to prove your status. Now, it may be that you send in a form like that, and then they call you into White Plains to verify your status. But that defeats the problem that you're trying to overcome by putting the table at high school. You know that it's difficult to get 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds to focus on this. It's just the way it is. Young people have other priorities in their life, and you're working very, very hard to get more than just a handful of people motivated enough to sign up to vote. And if it turns out that there's the extra steps, it just like that, you get young people to say, "Oh, I ain't doing that. I'm going to play basketball today, or I got to study, or I'm going out with my girlfriend or boyfriend." And I think it could sink significantly the efforts to reach out to young people to get them to sign up when you're making it convenient by going to high school or even going to college campus and registering people to vote. If you can't register them remotely with a document that you're going to mail, then you say, well, listen, sign up to vote, and we'll bring you down to White Plains you're going to get nowheres near like the response you're getting now. And even now it's tough, and it'll be worse with this bill in place.
So, George, I'm personally going to ask you to add that to your list because,
Yes.
as you know, voter registration drives and events are huge within the League of Women Voters. And I have to tell you from experience that we register 16 and 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds at high school, 200 or more, applications at a time that we hand walk in to the Board of
Right.
Elections. So this is going to have a huge impact, especially on young voters because a 16-year-old, how are they going to get down to the Board of Elections after school?
Right.
To your
Well, I
point.
mean, when I was 18 years old, I did not yet have a driver's license. I didn't get it till a little bit later, and I would have been out of luck. No way my father was going to take off time from work to drive me to White Plains. I have to
Mhm.
get on the old bus and all that. But yes, it's a discouraging factor, and I think that is part of the philosophy of the bill. That we
Yeah.
don't want to make it easy for you. We want you to jump through hoops before you can vote. It may even be part of this whole mindset that says, if you want the right to vote, you have to really earn it by going through these hoops. That somehow, it shouldn't be easy to vote because of their philosophy that, you'll then make the decision on different basis. And I think there are political calculations, and I'll leave it at that,
Okay.
who votes and who doesn't vote benefits or doesn't benefit certain candidates and individuals.
Okay. Our next question is from Lois Francis Harrison, and she's referring to naturalized citizens. Would you need to provide the naturalization certificate plus your new U.S. passport, which, as you already mentioned, could take up to 6 months before you get it?
I assume that's true. Once again, I have to go back and look at the language because of this specific situation. But if you're a naturalized citizen, you have no birth certificate that shows you were born in the country by definition. So it'd be your naturalization papers plus and or in place of something else.
Mhm.
And now it may be that in this coming climate where there's deportation in the air everywhere, and if the deportation plans are implemented the way the president and Tom Homan uh, uh, believe it will be, We will see active deportation. We may see the American military on the streets of American cities uh, taking people away because they can't prove their citizenship. On that kind of a basis, if I were a naturalized citizen, I'd keep those papers on me 24/7, the same way I keep my driver's license and my credit cards on me, because at a moment's notice, I might have to prove that I'm an American citizen. But it is another hoop to jump through if you're a naturalized citizen, since the birth certificate is off the chart. And then complicate it with the names and, everything we just said about women. You're a naturalized citizen and you change your name after that, and how do you prove? It's a complication that's a multiplier.
Okay. We've got a question from Sarah Silver, and she's asking, at what stage is HR 22 in the House?
It's expected to come on the floor next week. So we will have votes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. What I don't know, being in the minority and not being in leadership, is what day they plan to have it come up, and if it would be bumped off further, because we do think we may see the budget resolution on the House side from the House majority. And if that comes on the floor, that will be a major activities. If the vote is bumped off from next week, I don't know that at this stage of the game. We're working on the basis that this is going to come up next week. Which day next week, I can't tell you. Um, Generally, they do not have controversial votes on the day of arrival, which would be this coming Monday, the 24th. So if I had to guess, I'd say either Tuesday or Wednesday. Thursday's the day of departure next week, where people head back home. You'll see me on Amtrak train number 141 in the south, leaving New Rochelle at 7:26, and the return train is usually 2 o'clock. Amtrak 94, leaving Union Station for New Rochelle. So it's not likely to be on Monday or Thursday. I suspect it'll be Tuesday or Wednesday. If that changes, I'm happy, Kathy, to communicate with you, and you can communicate with your colleagues.
That would be great. Thank you, George.
Will do.
Terry Toll has another question. Is the lack of evidence for voter fraud being broadcast across social media to alert voters to speak out against it? And she
You
feels
know,
we need to spin this really
yeah.
widely.
Yeah, Terry, here's the problem, and this applies to a lot of different things. One of the biggest issues I'm dealing with right now in this job, these many months in this office, we've just basically set this office up in the last 2.5 weeks, is the argument that you're not doing enough to get the message out on everything. You're not doing enough on Musk. You're not doing enough on the cuts that they're making, and we've got to stand up and we've got to shut up. And I think of the press conference I had today. I think of the press we did 2 weeks ago when we filed the bill to oppose Elon Musk's takeover. The lawsuits that have been filed to try to stop, slow down these things. The work we did on the pause, which was the week before the Elon Musk thing broke. Just today, while we were doing our press conference, he announces he's going to terminate congestion pricing. That's going to pick up a lot of buzz over the next few hours and days. We're constantly dealing, Terry, with trying to communicate in an environment where we don't have the attention of people. I've had back and forth today. People have said, "I don't know what you're doing. You're not doing anything." And then I send them clips from what I said on the floor and press releases and when the clip went into this publication or that publication. And they look and they go, but I don't know. And I almost want to say, where are you getting your news from? LOHUD isn't printing any of this stuff. News 12 might cover it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The other major TV stations, this is not the kind of issue. This is not a car crash issue or a crime and punishment issue to cover it. MSNBC and CNN follow these things, but they don't pick every single legislator to focus on. And, I kind of look like 300 some odd of the legislators. There's no particular reason to pick George Latimer to speak because I don't represent a unique demographic or whatever the heck I'm supposed to represent. So it's very easy for people to say, you got to do more, you got to do more. That is why we went to this effort. That's why we did the press conference. That is why Kathy graciously was willing to set up the Zoom call. There have been other controversial issues, but we can't do a Zoom call every week. And someone says, you got to do a town hall. We're doing a virtual town hall after the president's State of the Union message. He's doing his message on the 4th. We're going to do a virtual town hall on the 5th. Why? Because in that message, he's going to lay it all out there. Not just this week, we're jumping up and down over naming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, or we're going to take over Greenland, or we're going to tear down Gaza and make it a resort, or we're going to throw Zelensky out because we're cutting a deal with Putin. This is what I'm facing, what we're all facing right now. So to the extent, Terry, that I've been on social media, and I have been, you'd have to spend all day going on Facebook and X and Instagram and Blue Sky to see where we've made comments about different things. I gave a speech on the floor about tariffs. I gave a speech on the floor to defend supporting California in the wildfires because they're trying to attach political strings to FEMA support for California because they're going after California as a progressive state and so forth. So it's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to you depending on what media you consume. What media do you consume? And if you're watching MSNBC or CNN, they're cutting in with Trump, and then they might turn to a Hakeem Jeffries or one or so commenters. AOC gets on a lot because she's a popular name and a face, and they'll cover what she says. And then in the legacy media, maybe you read the Washington Post every day, maybe you read the New York Times every day. I try to read those two newspapers. There's The Hill and Politico and so forth. I've done a ton of interviews with all these folks, but Trump has the bully pulpit. And I was county executive. I had a bully pulpit as county executive on the county level of attention. Most people didn't pay much attention to the county. When you did pay attention, I was there giving you COVID and all the other things we were doing. But at the level that Trump is at, he sucks all the air out. And so, yes, I posted on Facebook. We will do more. I'm getting ready for the next press on this as best as we can. But this effort right now, just like the press conference today, is trying to address the very thing that you're saying. How do we get the message out? This is how we get the message out.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, even though our chat room is full of questions and comments. We'd be here all night. So I want to wrap this up in a few minutes. But Claudia Mausner has another question as well. What happened to Republican support for local rule? This appears to be federal overreach into state decision-making.
Look, I think the philosophy has been pretty simple. When you don't control the federal government, but you control approximately 28 states, there are more red states than there are blue states. Forget the population size. North Dakota has a smaller population than Westchester County, but North Dakota is a state with 2 U.S. senators and electoral vote that its 800 some odd voters attach. Our 1 million voters in Westchester are subsumed in the overall New York situation. When you have 28 states, but you don't have the federal government, your argument is states' rights. Let the states decide. We want these states to ban abortion or come close to banning abortion, and that's what they did. When Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, how many states put as many restrictions as they could get right up to what borderline wouldn't cross Roe v. Wade? Roe v. Wade is gone. So now that you have a majority side in both houses that appear to be anti-choice, now you can expect to see a national answer because you have the votes nationally to do what you want. And that, I think, is what happens in a bill like this. These provisions are in place in some, I'm going to guess, I don't know the exact number, in some dozen states already, in what we would call red states. You already have these kinds of what I consider draconian provisions. And so the purpose of this law now that you control the House and the Senate is to try to force it down the throats of the blue states that would not on their own do this because New York decision makers do not believe this is a necessary thing. Too bad. We control the federal government and you're going to live by our rules now. That's what I think you're seeing. And as far as their concern for local control, yes, local control, if we control the local, because then we control the philosophy. But if local is controlled by a different philosophy, we're going to override it because we want our philosophy to dominate the American political scene. And I don't think what I'm saying is particularly unique or controversial. I think you all knew that already before I said it.
Okay, one final question and then a comment, and then I'm going to close. And I'll give you a moment to make your final comments as well.
Thank you.
But from Ellen Borenstein, she's asking, what do you think could be renegotiated? And could you explain where the bill is and Senate approval needed?
Well, the bill is ready to be presented to the House floor. As I've said, I expect it to come next week, a day or two. So it's not in a committee. It's not up for further discussion. It's going to be on the House floor as is. The bill could be, and these are some of the maneuvers. We may have a vote to refer the bill back to committee. And if the majority votes no on that vote to recommit, then the bill will be on the floor to be voted on. The majority side has enough votes to pass it. They don't want to then negotiate anything. They don't need to give away anything. This is what they want, and they'll pass it. If the House passes it with a majority, a strong majority, then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate does not have enough votes to stop it flat out, but they could filibuster to delay it long enough and then potentially stop it. The majority side does not have enough votes right now in their majorities to raise the debt limit. And the president wants to raise the debt limit because he has plans, it is reported, to provide a big tax cut to the wealthy again. And in order to do that, he needs both cuts in spending and he needs more debt ceiling to be able to do that big tax cut. If the Republicans can't get enough votes, then he has to deal with the Democrats, but we'll see what negotiation leverage we have because the things we want, they don't want us to have. And I don't know how they're going to give that to us. And we have the same kind of battle coming up with the continuing resolution to keep the government open. The Democrats don't want to shut down government, but we're not going to vote for a bill that's got all kinds of bad policy in it to keep the government open. And if you guys are shoving, fix our forest down our throats, Lake and Riley, and then you're going to shove the SAVE Act down our throats, why aren't we voting for your bills to be good guys? That doesn't make sense. So where the bill is going to be on the House floor, we believe next week. If it passes the House, if we can stop it, great. If we can get it recommitted, great. But if we can't, passes, it goes to the Senate, and then it's time for us senators, and Kirsten and Chuck are well aware of these things, to filibuster and try to slow it down and delay it. Much of what we're trying to do in legislation, it's a long road, is to try to delay. Go to court of public opinion, try to delay things, get it to the point where we hope we can win the House or Senate in 26. And the Senate's a tough pick because of we're 3 seats down, and we have more vulnerable seats in the next cycle than they do. But so a lot of it focuses on the House. If you win the House, what have you gained? You've gained the ability to stop doing certain things that a legislature can do. But the legislature can't undo pardons. The president has the power to pardon. Those 1,600 people that he pardoned, they're free. The Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, they're free. We can't reverse that. The only way you stop that is by winning the presidency the next time that there's an election, assuming there's an election.
And a final comment that I want to share from Christiane Deschamps, and I apologize if I mispronounced your surname, but Christiane says, it seems this would hurt Republican voters too, correct?
Well, yes, because the analogy I used, if you are and I picked Somers because Somers is at a distance from White Plains, North Salem. It's a long distance from northern Westchester down to White Plains. If you are a woman who is getting married and you come back from your honeymoon and this law is in effect and you live in Somers, you're going to have to get in a car and go down to White Plains during the working business day to change your name on your voting registration. And if you're a Republican, you have to go through the same process as if you're a Democrat or an independent. So yes, that is a burden to you. Whether you see that as important enough and overriding other things, I can't tell you. So, there are people for whom practicality will be what covers it. And some other people say, well, ideologically, I want to cut down on all these people voting because all they're doing is coming in and voting on the other side. And I want to win and I want our people to be in charge. But it does affect them individually, regardless of their party affiliation, because they have to go through the same rules.
Okay. Thank you, George. Thank you, Congressman George Latimer. Do you have some final words you want to leave us with? And then I'll close.
Well, with apologies to you and Beth and Louise and anybody else who was there today, there may be a few others I haven't looked at all across the thing. I closed my comments today, and I'll close it in the same way. I can't imagine what went through George Washington's mind when he was at Valley Forge. I lived in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. I used to travel to the historic park where they had the little huts where these guys wintered it out during the Revolution, and the army almost broke apart, and they were facing, the British army, and they could have easily been discouraged, and that would have been the end of it. Somehow George Washington held it together. But what went through his mind when he looked at how bleak things looked? Abraham Lincoln had times during the Civil War where things were not going the way of the Unions. The Union's way, the beginning of the war started badly. Antietam and a few other battles, Chancellorsville, not to run a history lesson here, but there were times when Lincoln, sitting in the White House in that moody way, that thoughtful way that he sat there wondering if he could hold this thing together. Franklin Roosevelt sat in the White House watching the Nazis march under the l'Arc de Triomphe in France and overrunning Western Europe and pushing the world to the brink. And when all of those different things are at hand, you ask yourself, can we win? Is this possible to overcome this? We know how the story ended for Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. Over time, we succeeded. There were a lot of deaths in these wars. There was a lot of deprivation. There was a lot of misdeeds on both sides, because that's what happens in wars. But at the end of the day, the democracy survived, and Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt go down as the three greatest presidents because they somehow found the ability to go on. It's only 4 weeks. I have the same emotions that you have. But one of the problems is when we get angry, when we get fearful, we start looking for some way to express that. Some of that's being expressed back to those of us who are on your side. You're not doing enough. I don't hear you. How come you're not doing this? How do we stop Musk? We must stop Musk. And I don't have a military army that can go in and grab Elon Musk. We've got to have fortitude. We've got to believe that we're right and that over time we will succeed, but it may not be over the course of the next month or 2 months or 6 months. But what's the alternative? The alternative is a long, dark night. I'm not prepared for that. I've spent 37 years in public office, and I've done things that I thought were important to get to this point in my life where I'm 71 years old. And in some ways, I don't really need to do this. But we're doing it for a reason because of what we believe. That's why you're in the league. So, without being able to give you chapter and verse, have faith, work hard, and I believe we'll get through this, and I believe we'll reverse the direction we're in. But it won't be easy, and it won't happen in a minute or two.
So George, once again, the League of Women Voters of Westchester thanks you. Great idea to get us all together this evening to really learn more and have our questions answered. I too am going to close similarly to the way I did at the press conference today, because I have a call for action for everybody on this call and beyond. Regardless of whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, the League asks you all to join together to oppose the SAVE Act and protect people's freedom to vote. Every citizen should contact their congressmember now to oppose the SAVE Act. We don't have much time left. Tomorrow's Thursday already, but get online and either write to George, obviously Mike Lawler here in CD 17, of which is where I live, which I've already done, but I'm going to send a few more messages tomorrow. I close with the League always empowers voters. We defend democracy because it is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your all coming together. And let's get the whole group here so we can see everybody. And again, George, I just want to thank you so much for, your willingness to chat with all of us tonight.
Thank you,
So
Kathy.
good night,
Thank you all.
everybody.
See you around town.
Okay. Good night, everybody.